Society loves to tear down anyone who doesn't fit their perfect mold. When a room full of elite, size 0 socialites publicly humiliated a plus-size nanny, they thought they had won. They didn't realize the deadliest man in the city was standing right behind them, ready to burn their world down. Penelope Gallagher was fully aware of the space she occupied in the world. At a size 22, she was unapologetically fat, possessing soft, generous curves that most high society employers viewed as a liability rather than a simple physical trait. She had spent her entire life navigating a world built for smaller people, enduring the sideways glances, the unsolicited diet advice, and the subtle, biting microaggressions that came with being a heavy woman in a superficial city. Yet Penny was also the most highly sought-after pediatric trauma specialist at the Wellington Domestic Staffing Agency in Boston. She didn't just babysit, she healed. That was precisely why she had been placed at the heavily fortified estate in western Massachusetts, working for a man whose name was only spoken in hushed, terrified whispers across the eastern seaboard. Dominic Rossi. Dominic was the undisputed head of the Rossi Syndicate, a sprawling, ruthless empire built on shipping ports, construction unions, and blood. He was a widower, left with a traumatized 6-year-old daughter, Mia, who hadn't spoken a single word since witnessing her mother's violent death in a crossfire 2 years prior. Dozens of thin, impeccably educated, bilingual nannies had come and gone, all failing to break through the child's silent shell. Then came Penny, with her warm laugh, her soft lap, and her absolute refusal to be intimidated by the armed guards or Dominic's icy, menacing glare. Penny had done the impossible. Within 3 months, Mia was not only speaking, but laughing. Dominic, a man who viewed the world through the cold calculus of threats and assets, watched this transformation from the shadows of his mahogany-paneled office. He noticed everything. He noticed the way Penny's eyes crinkled when she smiled, the way she fiercely protected Mia from the overly aggressive paparazzi, and much to his own quiet realization, the way her soft, lush body moved gracefully through his sprawling mansion. But tonight, Dominic was supposedly in New York, settling a brutal territorial dispute, and Penny was walking into the Lion's Den alone. It was the night of the Wellington Agency's annual charity gala, held at the opulent Fairmont Copley Plaza in downtown Boston. It was a mandatory event for the top-tier staff and the ultra-wealthy families who employed them. Penny had dreaded this evening for weeks. She had saved up to buy a beautiful emerald green velvet gown that hugged her curves and complemented her copper hair. But the moment she stepped onto the marble floors of the grand ballroom, she felt the familiar, suffocating weight of judgment. The room was a sea of Ozempic-fueled socialites and nannies who looked more like runway models than caregivers. They were dripping in Harry Winston diamonds and poured into size 0 Prada and Vera Wang gowns. As Penny handed her coat to the attendant, she immediately caught the eye of Evelyn Croft, the draconian director of the Wellington Agency, who was speaking with Cynthia Montgomery. Cynthia was a Beacon Hill matriarch, notoriously cruel, whose husband controlled half the real estate in the financial district. "Good Lord, Evelyn," Cynthia's shrill voice carried effortlessly over the string quartet playing in the corner. "Is that the Gallagher woman? I thought you told me she was let go." "She takes up half the foyer." Evelyn offered a tight, Botox-frozen smile, swirling her champagne. "I tried to reassign her, Cynthia. But you know how these new money clients are. They don't understand the image Wellington tries to project. Frankly, it's embarrassing. How is she supposed to chase after a toddler? She looks like she ate the previous nanny." A chorus of cruel giggles erupted from the circle of women surrounding them. Penny's face flushed hot, the words hitting her like physical blows. She kept her chin high, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She moved toward the back of the ballroom, finding a quiet alcove near the ice sculptures. She just needed to survive the next 2 hours, make her mandatory appearance, and go back to the Western estate where she felt safe, where she felt valued. But high society is a blood sport, and the sharks had smelled blood in the water. Over the next hour, the microaggressions escalated into blatant bullying. When Penny stood in line for the catered hors d'oeuvres, a willowy nanny named Brittany stepped in front of her, loudly proclaiming, "Oh, let me go first. I think you've definitely had enough calories for one lifetime, sweetie." When Penny sat down at her assigned table, 2 of the wealthy mothers intentionally moved their chairs away, complaining loudly to a waiter about the lack of breathing room. The sheer audacity of their cruelty was staggering. They felt untouchable in their wealth and their thinness, secure in their belief that a fat woman had no right to exist in their gilded world, let alone be treated with basic human dignity. Penny gripped her glass of sparkling water, her knuckles turning white, silently counting down the minutes until she could escape. She didn't know that the atmosphere in the room was about to change permanently, or that the monsters in the ballroom were about to meet the devil himself. By 10 o'clock, the gala was in full swing, and the alcohol had completely dissolved whatever thin veneer of polite manners the Beacon Hill elite possessed. Cynthia Montgomery, emboldened by several glasses of vintage Dom Perignon, decided that ignoring Penny wasn't enough. She wanted her removed. Penny was standing near a towering display of red roses, checking her phone for a message from the estate's head of security about Mia's bedtime, when Cynthia flanked her. She was accompanied by Evelyn Croft and 3 younger, fiercely thin nannies who functioned as Cynthia's sycophants. "You know, Penelope," Cynthia slurred slightly, her eyes raking up and down Penny's plus-size frame with naked disgust. "I am on the board of this charity. We pride ourselves on excellence, on aesthetics, and quite frankly, your presence here is an insult to the standard we uphold." Penny took a deep breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Mrs. Montgomery, I am an employee of the Wellington Agency, invited just like everyone else. I am simply doing my job." "Your job?" Cynthia scoffed, stepping closer. "Your job is to be a background fixture, a servant. You are fat, sloppy, and entirely out of place. You belong in a suburban diner flipping pancakes, not mingling with Boston's finest. It makes my stomach turn just looking at how that cheap velvet stretches across your stomach." Penny felt the prickle of tears threatening to spill, but a deep, fiery anger was beginning to override her humiliation. "My worth is not determined by my dress size, Mrs. Montgomery, nor is it determined by your opinion of me." "Oh, the whale has a spine?" Cynthia mocked loudly, drawing the attention of dozens of nearby guests. Then, with a flick of her wrist that was entirely deliberate, Cynthia tipped her full glass of dark Cabernet Sauvignon forward. The red wine splashed violently across the bodice of Penny's emerald velvet dress, soaking through the fabric, ruining it instantly, and leaving a dark, humiliating stain across her chest and stomach. Laughter erupted from Cynthia's circle. Evelyn Croft just sighed, looking at Penny with disdain. "Look what you've done, Penelope, causing a scene. I think it's best you leave immediately before you embarrass the agency any further." Penny stood frozen, the cold wine seeping into her skin, the crushing weight of public humiliation bearing down on her. The entire ballroom seemed to stop and stare, whispering, pointing, laughing at the fat girl who dared to think she could wear velvet and stand among them. And then, the heavy, gilded mahogany doors of the grand ballroom blew open with a deafening crash. The string quartet squeaked to a horrifying halt. The laughter died in the throats of the elite. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single second. Striding through the doors was Dominic Rossi. He was a terrifying vision of violent power, wrapped in a custom-tailored charcoal Brioni suit. Standing 6'3", with sharp, aristocratic Italian features, raven black hair, and eyes as cold and dead as a winter ocean, he looked like a god of war walking into a tea party. He was flanked by 4 heavily armed enforcers, their suit jackets visibly bulging with concealed weapons. The Phantom of Boston wasn't supposed to be here. He despised society events. Yet here he was, exuding a lethal, suffocating aura that made the city's wealthiest men shrink back in pure terror. Politicians who took his bribes suddenly found their shoes very interesting. Cynthia Montgomery, completely oblivious to the real danger Dominic represented, and blinded by his immense wealth and rugged looks, immediately adjusted her posture, smoothing her dress. "Oh, Mr. Rossi, what an absolute honor. We didn't know you were—" Dominic didn't even look at her. He didn't acknowledge the mayor trying to wave at him. He didn't blink at the billionaire tech moguls parting like the Red Sea to let him through. His dark, lethal gaze was locked on one person. Penny. He saw the tears she was fighting back. He saw the red wine staining her beautiful green dress, and the air around him seemed to crackle with an unprecedented, murderous rage. Dominic walked directly past Cynthia, nearly knocking her shoulder as he stepped into the alcove. He stopped inches from Penny. The massive height difference forced her to look up into his dark eyes, and for the first time all night, Penny felt completely, utterly safe. Without a word, Dominic shrugged off his $10,000 Brioni jacket. He gently, almost reverently, wrapped it around Penny's shoulders, hiding the wine stain, the heavy, expensive wool radiating his body heat, and the faint scent of cedar and expensive tobacco. His large, calloused hands lingered on her shoulders, a highly possessive, intimate gesture that sent a collective gasp rippling through the ballroom. "Who did this to you?" Dominic's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the dead silence of the room, it echoed like a gunshot. It was a voice that had ordered the destruction of rival empires. Penny swallowed hard, trembling slightly, not from fear of him, but from the overwhelming adrenaline. "It was an accident, Mr. Rossi." Dominic's jaw clenched. He turned his head slowly, his dead eyes settling on Cynthia Montgomery, who was suddenly looking very pale, and Evelyn Croft, who looked like she was about to pass out. "I don't believe in accidents," Dominic stated, his voice smooth, dark, and laced with absolute malice. He stepped slightly in front of Penny, shielding her body with his own. "Mr. Rossi," Evelyn stammered, stepping forward on trembling legs. "I am the director of this agency. Penelope was just leaving. She was causing a disruption and—" "Shut your mouth," Dominic interrupted, not raising his voice, yet the command was so forceful, Evelyn physically snapped her jaw shut. "You run the Wellington agency, correct?" Yes, sir." "Not anymore," Dominic said coldly. He snapped his fingers, and one of his enforcers, a massive man named Matteo, stepped forward, handing Dominic a sleek black folder. Dominic tossed it onto a nearby cocktail table. "I bought the holding company that owns Wellington's debt 20 minutes ago. As of this exact second, I own this agency. And you are fired, Evelyn. If I ever see you near my employees again, you will find out exactly why they call my family a syndicate." Evelyn burst into tears, covering her mouth. But Dominic had already moved on. his predatory gaze locked onto Cynthia Montgomery. "And you," Dominic said, stepping toward the Beacon Hill socialite. Cynthia shrank back, terrified. "You poured wine on her." I, Cynthia stammered, her arrogance completely evaporating into sheer panic. She didn't belong here. Look at her. She's unseemly. She's not fit to represent our class." Dominic's hand shot out with terrifying speed, gripping the edge of the ice sculpture table so hard the thick glass groaned. "You speak of class, yet you possess the soul of a street rat. You look at this woman and you see someone beneath you. But let me make something very, very clear to everyone in this pathetic room." Dominic turned back to Penny, his cold eyes softening for a fraction of a second, a look no one in the criminal underworld had ever seen. He reached out, gently cupping Penny's soft, full cheek, his thumb wiping away a single tear that had managed to fall. "This woman," Dominic declared, his voice projecting across the silent ballroom, echoing with undeniable authority and dark promise. "This beautiful, brilliant woman is the only reason my daughter smiles. She is the light in my home. She is not my servant. She is my equal. And if any of you so much as breathe in her direction without absolute respect, I won't just ruin your reputations. I will take your businesses. I will take your homes. I will erase your bloodlines from this city." He pulled Penny closer, his arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her lush, curvy body flush against his lean, muscular frame. "She is my queen," Dominic Rossi snarled to the terrified elite. "And you will all bow, or I will break your legs to make you." The heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom slammed shut, cutting off the terrified gasps of the Beacon Hill elite. The heavy silence left in their wake felt like a physical weight, but for Penelope Gallagher, the only reality was the solid, muscular presence of Dominic Rossi. He guided her through the opulent corridors of the Fairmont Copley Plaza with a possessive, unyielding grip on her waist. The heavy wool of his custom charcoal suit jacket swallowed her shoulders, carrying the distinct, intoxicating scent of expensive cedar and faint gun smoke. Penny's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by a deep, trembling exhaustion and the stark realization of what had just occurred. The most dangerous man in Massachusetts had just claimed her as his queen in front of the city's wealthiest, most vicious socialites. As they stepped out into the freezing Boston air, a convoy of matte black SUVs was waiting at the curb. Heavily armed enforcers stood at absolute attention, their eyes scanning the perimeter with lethal precision. Matteo, the massive enforcer who had handed Dominic the agency's ownership papers, quickly pulled open the heavy, armored door of the lead vehicle. Dominic handed Penny inside with a gentleness that entirely contradicted the violence rolling off him just moments prior. Once the doors were sealed, plunging them into the soundproof, leather-scented darkness of the vehicle, the illusion of the gala finally broke. Penny leaned her head against the tinted glass, a single betraying tear slipping down her cheek, cutting through the dried Cabernet Sauvignon that had splashed onto her skin. Dominic's jaw clenched. The sight of her crying ignited a terrifying, possessive fury deep within his chest. He reached across the console, his large, calloused hands gently taking hold of her face, forcing her to look at him. "Do not shed a single tear for those worthless parasites, Penelope," Dominic murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. "They are nothing. They are dust beneath your feet. You are worth more than every single soul in that miserable ballroom combined." Penny sniffled, her soft, generous curves sinking into the plush leather seat. Mr. Rossi, I don't understand. You were supposed to be in New York. The syndicate meeting, the territorial dispute. Why are you here? Why did you do all of this for a nanny? Dominic's dark, cold eyes locked onto hers, holding a predatory intensity that made her breath hitch. You are not just a nanny, Penny. You haven't been just an employee since the day you walked into my estate and made my daughter laugh. I came back because I received intel that the territorial dispute in New York was a deliberate distraction, a smokescreen. Penny's eyes widened, the lingering humiliation from the gala instantly forgotten, replaced by a cold spike of fear. A distraction? For what? For a hit, Dominic stated flatly, his thumb softly tracing the curve of her jawline, contrasting the brutal nature of his words. Enzo Moretti, the head of the Brooklyn faction, decided he wanted to absorb my Boston ports. He knew he couldn't take me in a direct war, so he aligned himself with a local rat to stage a distraction in New York while his men moved on the Western estate. He intended to take Mia. Penny's blood ran completely cold. Mia, is she safe? We have to get to her immediately. She is entirely safe, Dominic reassured her, his grip on her face remaining firm and grounding. The estate is locked down under maximum security protocol. 50 heavily armed men are patrolling the perimeter. Nothing gets in. But the local rat who fed Moretti the security codes to my outer gates, that is where the night gets interesting. Dominic leaned back against the leather seat, an icy, terrifying smirk playing on his lips. The rat is Harrison Montgomery, Cynthia Montgomery's husband. He used his real estate shell corporations to launder Moretti's money into Boston. When I found out, I boarded a private jet back to the city. I was going to simply execute Harrison tonight, but then my security detail informed me that his wretched wife was publicly humiliating you at the gala. Penny gasped, her hands instinctively flying to her mouth. The sheer, interwoven cruelty of the elite world and the criminal underworld was staggering. Cynthia Montgomery had not just been a cruel socialite bullying a fat woman. She was the wife of a traitor who had tried to facilitate the murder of a 6-year-old child. I wanted to break them, Dominic said softly, his eyes darkening with a violent promise. I wanted to look Cynthia in the eye and let her know that the woman she deemed unworthy of her presence was the very woman I protect with my life. Harrison is currently tied to a chair in one of my soundproof warehouses by the docks. By tomorrow morning, the Montgomery Empire will be entirely liquidated, their assets seized by my shell companies, and Harrison will cease to exist. Cynthia will be left with absolutely nothing. No money, no status, no husband. She will spend the rest of her miserable life working a minimum wage job, knowing she crossed the wrong family. Penny stared at him, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of his power and his ruthlessness. He was a monster to the world, a brutal enforcer of his own violent laws. Yet, as she looked into his eyes, all she saw was a fiercely protective father and a man who looked at her soft, plus-size body, not with disgust, but with absolute, burning reverence. You called me your queen, Penny whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the SUV's engine. Dominic leaned in close, his breath brushing against her lips. Because you are. You brought life back into my home, Penelope. You brought life back into me. I have watched you for months. I have watched the way you carry yourself, the way you love my daughter, the way your beautiful body moves. I am a selfish, violent man, and I have decided that I am never letting you go. You belong with us. You belong with me. Before Penny could process the massive weight of his confession, the SUV swerved violently. A deafening explosion shattered the quiet night, the shockwave rocking the heavily armored vehicle and throwing Penny hard against Dominic's chest. The sky outside the tinted windows erupted into brilliant, terrifying orange flames. "Ambush!" Matteo roared from the front seat, racking the slide of an assault rifle. Moretti's men bypassed the outer perimeter. They hit the lead car with an RPG. Dominic's protective instincts exploded. He instantly forced Penny down onto the floorboards, covering her lush, heavy body entirely with his own massive frame. The sound of automatic gunfire began raining against the reinforced steel of the SUV like a deadly hailstorm. The war had come to Boston, and Penny was trapped right in the middle of it. The chaos outside the SUV was absolute. The matte black convoy had been forced to a halt on a desolate stretch of the highway, boxed in by burning wreckage and a dozen heavily armed mercenaries hired by Enzo Moretti. The reinforced glass of their vehicle spider-webbed under the relentless barrage of high-caliber bullets, holding strong for now, but threatening to give way under the sustained assault. "Stay down, Penny. Do not move a single muscle," Dominic commanded, his voice devoid of panic, replaced entirely by cold, military precision. He unholstered 2 heavy black tactical pistols from his shoulder rig. He looked at Matteo, exchanging a silent, deadly nod. Dominic kicked the heavy armored door open, using the reinforced steel as a shield, and stepped out into the chaotic crossfire. Penny lay trembling on the floorboards, her emerald velvet dress now stained with wine and ash, listening to the horrifying symphony of violence. She could hear Dominic roaring commands, his weapons firing with rhythmic, devastating accuracy. He was a demon unleashed, fighting not just for his territory, but for the woman cowering inside his vehicle. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The sounds of returning fire began to thin, replaced by the heavy thud of bodies hitting the asphalt. Penny squeezed her eyes shut, praying to whatever deity would listen that the man who had just promised her the world would survive the night. Suddenly, the passenger side door was ripped open. A bruised and bloodied mercenary, desperate and looking for a hostage, lunged into the vehicle, his hands grasping for Penny's hair. But Penny Gallagher was not a weak woman. A lifetime of carrying her own weight, of fighting against a society that constantly tried to push her down, had built a deep, unyielding strength within her. As the mercenary's hands closed around her shoulder, Penny grabbed the heavy metal fire extinguisher mounted under the passenger seat. With a guttural scream, she swung the red cylinder upward with all her strength, smashing it directly into the mercenary's face. The man collapsed backward out of the vehicle with a sickening crunch, instantly incapacitated. A split second later, Dominic was there. He stood over the unconscious mercenary, his chest heaving, his suit ruined and stained with blood that was not his own. He dropped his weapons, falling to his knees beside the open door, his eyes frantically scanning Penny for injuries. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his hands ghosting over her arms, her face, her heavy curves, desperate for confirmation that she was intact. "I'm fine," Penny breathed heavily, dropping the fire extinguisher, her hands shaking violently. "I'm okay, Dominic, I'm okay." Dominic let out a ragged breath, pulling her up from the floorboards and dragging her forcefully into his chest. He buried his face in her copper hair, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. But she didn't care. She wrapped her arms around his broad back, anchoring herself to the deadliest man in the city. The rest of the night was a blur of flashing lights, heavily armed cleanup crews, and the eventual, heavily guarded arrival at the Western estate. When they finally walked through the massive front doors, Mia was waiting in the grand foyer, flanked by 3 internal security guards. The little girl ran across the marble floor, completely ignoring her father, and buried her face directly into Penny's soft stomach, crying softly. Penny fell to her knees, wrapping her arms around the little girl, kissing the top of her head. "I'm here, sweetie. I'm right here. Nobody is going anywhere." Dominic stood watching them, the blood and violence of the night melting away in the presence of his family. He realized then that his empire meant absolutely nothing without the woman kneeling on his floor. Over the next few weeks, the criminal landscape of Boston was brutally reshaped. Enzo Moretti was found dead in a Brooklyn alleyway, a clear message sent by the Rossi syndicate that Boston was entirely off-limits. Harrison Montgomery disappeared without a trace, his vast real estate empire collapsing overnight under sudden, massive federal investigations, triggered by anonymous tips. Cynthia Montgomery, entirely stripped of her wealth, her mansion, and her status, was last seen moving into a tiny, run-down apartment in a forgotten suburb. Her high society friends having completely abandoned her the second her money dried up. Evelyn Croft was permanently blacklisted from the staffing industry. The Wellington agency completely restructured under Dominic's ruthless corporate oversight. But within the fortified walls of the Western estate, a different kind of transformation took place. Penelope Gallagher never wore a nanny's uniform again. Dominic married Penny in a private, heavily guarded ceremony in Italy just 3 months later. There were no size 0 socialites, no cruel whispers, and no fake smiles. There was only a breathtaking, plus-size bride in a custom-made, heavily beaded ivory gown that hugged every generous curve, and a Mafia king who looked at her as if she had hung the moon and the stars. Penny Rossi became the undisputed matriarch of the Rossi family. She utilized Dominic's massive wealth to build pediatric trauma centers across the East Coast, turning his bloody empire into a source of healing. She walked through the elite circles of Boston, not as a servant to be mocked, but as the untouchable, powerful wife of the city's true ruler. The high society women who had once laughed at her now lowered their eyes in fear and absolute respect whenever she entered a room, terrified of the lethal shadow that constantly watched over her. Society had tried to tear Penny down for not fitting their mold. They had tried to make her feel small because she was fat. But Dominic Rossi had looked at her heavy, beautiful body and seen the only woman strong enough to carry the immense weight of his world. He had walked into a ballroom of monsters and pulled his queen from the ashes, giving her a crown forged in velvet and blood. And Penelope Rossi wore it flawlessly.